Hi, and welcome to the Nashville Post Conversations with the mayoral candidates in the runoff. I'm Stephen Elliott, editor of the Post. We're here at Aiken Partners Peabody Plaza for a conversation sponsored by Baker Group Strategies. Today, we're speaking with Freddie O'Connell. Thank you. Congrats on making it to the runoff. We have Freddie O'Connell here.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for coming. So I want to talk about a lot of different things as you prepare for the runoff.
It's good news because so do I.
One thing is missed opportunities. You've been on council for 8 years, and any government of this size, there's always things that slip through the cracks or people forget about over the course of time. One recent example that I was somewhat struck by was the COVID pods that the city helped use federal funds to acquire for emergency shelter for people during COVID, and they were never used, and they're sitting in a lot somewhere around here, I think.
Yep.
So how do you make sure stuff like that doesn't happen?
I think this is, I will say from my perspective on council, I was keenly aware of some of the missed opportunities, and some of those informed my decision to run in the first place. There's always a question of prioritization, almost triage, like you're going to have to make a ton of decisions, and then how do you prioritize this? To me, during COVID, we unfortunately ignored some of the guidance we were getting from partners both in HUD and the CDC, specifically to take care of the pods, to your point. We're part of a process of trying to take care of unhoused Nashvillians in a pandemic. We missed some opportunities to, sooner than we did, ever take advantage of vacant hotels or other buildings that had suitability for housing, to avoid what we wound up doing, which was a large single-purpose congregate shelter at the fairgrounds. That was not what was generally advised as best practices. It didn't match what a lot of other cities did. I think of moments like our failure to acquire the Graves property out in Bells Bend to the tune of about $7 million, when just up the road here, we, after missing an opportunity to buy it at $11 million, we paid almost twice for 88 Hermitage Avenue, which wound up being about 3 times the price of what it would have cost to buy hundreds of acres out in Bells Bend. I think being on the executive side, you're confronted with the choices. You look at the overall fiscal capacity of the city, but I also think this is what this election is fundamentally about, which is priorities. And I think I am coming at it from the standpoint of, how do we align the priorities of where we know Nashvillians are actually living their lives, and the things that we have heard all, not just this year, but really since COVID, and why I think we're hearing so many Nashvillians say still that they feel like the city's on the wrong track. And it has to do with how Metro manages growth, how Metro makes choices to invest in a school versus any of the other things that we have done that felt like a misalignment of priorities. But I feel like, again, there was an opportunity to lean into the post-COVID response to the opioid epidemic. That is still something that we need to do, because we know that that is costing lives and having a huge public health impact. We know that one of Nashville's great crises that we started to put a little bit of emphasis on with some of our American Rescue Plan Act one-time federal money is the child care crisis in the city. And I think I'm trying to be aware of all of these things, and I'm already thinking about, if we succeed on September 14th, there are a lot of things that we will continue that are really good and important things that the Cooper administration did, but I think there are also, we want to be emphatic about making use of things that we already have, or having a stronger approach to federal and state partnerships that means we're back engaged in a process that should mean more one-time federal money coming into Nashville, because we've missed a lot of those opportunities as well.
You've talked a lot about your experience on council, before that, the Transit Authority, being involved in Metro for so many years. And then, we're talking about these problems that the city's facing that you are arguing you're best equipped to handle. I think a natural reaction, at least from some, would be, well, you've been involved for so many years, so why would you be the person to be able to fix some of this stuff you're talking about?
And I think the answer is, we've also seen what happens when someone with no familiarity who just comes in to run government like a business, the approach that leads to is not any better. I would say knowledge of the Metro departments, if you look at overall District 19, which I've represented on the Metro Council, and the overall performance of the district from people want to live here. We've seen more residential growth in District 19 than any other part of the city. People want to create jobs here. We've seen more jobs growth in District 19 than any other part of the city. People want to invest here. We've seen more construction growth in places that is generally not having a displacement effect, but is rather high quality infill development on otherwise vacant land. And I think those trends have indicated, here's how we do this. Here's how we balance growth and preservation. Here's how we try to first build a tool and apply it, like the recent payment in lieu of taxes model for mixed income housing that's going to result in the first several hundred units of long-term affordable housing in downtown in 15 years. What I'm excited about is taking the successes we've had in District 19 and applying that overall template that's very community-driven, very inclusive, and understands where growth is supposed to be and where neighborhood protections are supposed to be, how we deliver affordability, accessibility, infrastructure improvements, and do that on a citywide basis. I think that's been the interesting thing is, I've not been responsible for the entire city yet. I've been responsible for a place where we've generally watched it. If you look at the validation of District 19 voters in particular in this most recent election, we performed very well in my home district.
You've also talked about Lower Broad, the most visible part of the district perhaps, turning into a place where you don't necessarily want to bring your kids. And that's happened really over the last decade or so, I would say. So you wouldn't want to export that to other areas?
No, that's a great example though of a place where executive function and the disruption that have happened in Metro also have a big impact. Last term, I had great partners in first the Berry and then Briley administration to work on downtown issues, and frankly, in those moments, you could see some leading indicators of where downtown was heading, but that was kind of before the explosion of party buses or some of the worst behaviors we'd seen in and around the entertainment district. COVID was extremely disruptive, both from how businesses responded, how patrons responded. I do think we've seen some worse behaviors as pent-up anxiety, frustration, isolation have spilled out into post-COVID world. But we've also needed to strengthen the relationship between the district council member for the entertainment district and the administration, and that's just been harder to accomplish on the other side of COVID. But I would say, even here in our very last council meeting, we are going to work on a noise bill that does seem to have some pretty broad consensus that covers most of the operators there, has the full support of the police, who actually requested a big part of it, ongoing conversations with the codes department. If you look at the number of complaints I've gotten about party buses, for instance, they've fallen off sharply since I led the regulatory overhaul that gave us full regulatory capacity to tackle that. I think we are still looking at our overall enforcement capabilities as Metro, but I think also having that front row seat to that, even without previously the executive capability to say we need to do this, this, and this, or the stronger partnership I enjoyed before COVID with mayor's offices. I think we can, working together with a new district council member, really get our arms around it in a way that allows businesses to succeed, allows our destination economy to continue to thrive, but also embraces a cultural tourism that celebrates everything about Music City, but also the amazing opportunities that are downtown specifically for families, because the National Museum of African American Music, the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum, when the symphony does petting zoos for instruments, right? These are great moments. The Frist Art Museum has incredible programs for young people. The Nashville Children's Theater is just around the corner. There are so many family opportunities in downtown, and I think some of the lessons we've drawn from the entertainment district also necessarily inform what we hope to accomplish on the East Bank.
kids are back in school. There's a special session coming up that was called in response to the Covenant shooting earlier this year. It's unclear what will get done in that special session, but one thing the legislature and the governor did do earlier this year was funding for SROs in schools across the state. In Metro, leaders in the police and the schools have sort of been reluctant to say they would be able to take advantage of that for various reasons, and I heard you say that you are okay with that at the elementary level. So what would you tell a parent of an elementary kid who is scared, who doesn't think the legislature is going to do much more, who wants the schools to take advantage of that?
I would say they're doing the right thing by speaking up. I mean, in our school community where our daughter is, we've been through multiple lockdowns. Both our younger and older daughters, one of whom is in elementary and one of whom is in middle, we know what the safety protocols are there. It's actually the culture of both schools has a strong PTO, a strong PTSO, and I think ultimately to me that's exactly the right approach, is on a school by school basis with the school leader in any individual school, the school community, and the district and MMPD together should be working on the plans for how they keep people safe. I will say, both of our daughters were in school on the day of the Covenant shooting, and to be perfectly honest, I was more concerned about getting a handle on the Covenant situation and the families there and supporting them. And I could actually feel okay about where our daughters were because I knew both schools had already been through a lot of training, a lot of safety protocol initiatives, and it wasn't like I thought, oh no, there's no SRO there, right? I think if you look at I always try to come at this from the standpoint of what works, and if you look at the data on the presence of SROs, it is not fundamentally the deterrent that we hope it is, and that's why I think it is really important to understand the perspective of the district, the perspective of MNPD, look at our capacity, look at where the state is wanting their jurisdictions to be. But fundamentally, you think about, I'll say from my perspective, more guns is not proving to be to Nashville's advantage. If we look at one of the biggest epidemics we have of guns being stolen from vehicles, and how that is then linked to an increase in gun violence in the city, my hope is that the one thing we get out of this special session is some ability for local jurisdictions to be able to encourage stronger responsibility for gun owners leaving their guns and vehicles in an unsecured way.
How do you advocate for that? If you're a mayor, how do you advocate with the legislature for things like that, given the difference of opinion on a lot of these things?
I think it's really, for me, I'll say it this way, it's the same thing that we saw in the wake of the Covenant shooting. I was present with so many of the families that were calling loudly, consistently, in large numbers for stronger gun safety measures. I think just ensuring that legislators in particular get to hear directly from the families involved at Covenant is one of the most powerful things that I can do as mayor. Honestly, in so many ways, their voices are more meaningful and more powerful than mine, but I want to make sure we're facilitating responsible and appropriate conversations. I think you've probably heard Governor Lee's personal connection to the tragedy informing his decision to call a special session. It's important to keep talking about these issues, and I want to do so in a way that achieves goals that we know are important to Nashville, including specifically the gun storage piece. I don't think it's likely that we'll see any kind of risk protection order bill emerge from this General Assembly, but I think it's important for legislators to understand why families, specifically those involved in Covenant, but also those in the counties around Nashville, because one of the most powerful things that I saw in those weeks where there were strong and vocal calls before the General Assembly went out of session in April was watching students come in from Sumner County, from Williamson County, from Cheatham County, and participate in this, because we know that students in striking distance of Nashville, a stone's throw from where we are, are just as concerned and just as motivated to see the General Assembly take action that is more than just, hey, we'd like to see more guns in schools.
I want to talk about the sort of business deals that Metro is involved with. I think the Titan Stadium, just over your shoulder over here, has been one of the main talking points of the last year during this campaign. And you were vocally opposed to that for a lot of different reasons. But as the council member for District 19, where all this economic activity has taken place that you described earlier, there have been admittedly smaller types of deals that the city has engaged with. And one that comes to mind is Church Street Park, the park across the street from the downtown library. There was a plan several years ago for a downtown developer to swap some land, and he was going to build this condo high-rise there,
Yep.
give the city some land elsewhere, help us out with homeless services center, and you were supporting that.
Can you show me where I supported that?
I actually watched a Parks Board meeting this morning from 2018,
Yep.
where you said, you didn't have a banner, waving, but you said, I think this is better than the current.
I said I think anything is better than the status quo.
Yeah.
And that was true. And if parks couldn't do better than the status quo, then I think it's important to consider all options. But I also feel like we wanted to leave the space for could the park perform better, which is something I also articulated throughout.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough. I guess what I'm trying to ask you is, back then, a lot of the opponents used a lot of the same talking points that people are using about the stadium now. Well, it's a giveaway to developers, no bid, it's Metro land that we're giving so that he can make money. So what would you tell your supporters who, if they were paying attention then, probably were opposed to that at the time too?
So look at what was happening. You actually had multiple parties, all of whom had a vested interest in that, and I thought it was equally problematic to hand over control of the park to the major landowner that was immediately adjacent to it, again, in a no-bid circumstance. The mayor's office wanted to hand design over the park to a hand-picked developer in a no-bid circumstance. If you're trying to get to maximum flexibility, what Director of Planning Lucy Kemp called for, which I did vocally support, which was we should have a public hearing about the best future for this to source ideas, look at options. I have a letter from the administration saying we were going to do exactly that, and it never happened. That kind of process is what I think is continuing to erode trust and confidence in how Metro does business. And I think that what I would say to my supporters is look at how much energy I spent on trying to get a strong public process around the future of this park.
And today, how do you feel the park has improved?
So what we did was, I think, maybe the best outcome minus what I would have preferred to see, which is a little more public engagement around the future. We have systematically activated the park. We have brought in a partnership that was broader than just the initial stakeholder representing a major property owner adjacent to the park. The Civic Design Center has been involved. The Nashville Downtown Partnership has been involved. Both Metro Parks and the Nashville Public Library have been involved. And what you're seeing is now a park space that is open and available to everyone, that no longer needs police officers permanently stationed there alongside the park, is staffed appropriately for an urban park, has children's activities, has live music. The overall success of the park, I think, is one of the hallmarks of broader partnerships. And the one missing ingredient, I think, on getting there would have been to have urban residents more deeply involved in what next steps they want to see taken. That's something I hope to do.
One of the concerns a couple years ago when this process was taking place over how to activate the park was the unhoused people who spent a lot of time in that park. Some service providers thought that they had been rushed out and there wasn't a good solution for them of where they could go. So I'm wondering if you think the city has done well enough at paths out of these encampments for those people who are there.
This may be one of the chief frustrations I had that also informed my decision around. We made a lot of decisions that resulted in effectively a mass resignation from our homeless impact division, which is really frustrating to me because we had some talented, compassionate people that worked on everything from improving the homeless management information system, the way we capture data about homeless Nashvillians, and that was an oversight committee that I chaired. We worked closely with staff and a bunch of stakeholders to get to the best data we've ever had about homeless Nashvillians. We had an important conversation about encampments and public space. Obviously, the state stepped in and intervened and changed state law to make some things incompatible with local decisions. I would say we haven't done enough. This goes back to your first question about pods, but I'm going to give Mayor Cooper a lot of credit for ending this period and investing more money than we've ever invested as a city into mitigating homelessness to the tune of $50 million. My hope is that we elevate the role of the Homelessness Planning Commission, reinvest in the strategic community planning process, which I was a part of the first time. We had a good plan. It was mostly ignored. If we had coupled that with the good data sets we had a pathway to better. I don't think we've done well enough, but I would say today I'm cautiously optimistic about the work ahead in terms of how we both care for homeless residents and make public spaces truly accessible. The model of what's happening in the Nashville Public Library, it's hard because you can go in there and you can see people in different stages of where they are in their life, and there may be some people experiencing homelessness that are in the library, but it also manages to be a place where anybody can go check out a book, has a robust children's section with great programming, but also embraces being more than just stacks of books and periodicals, and has a social services mission, does things for young people. The teen programs and facilities at the Nashville Public Library are fantastic, and adjacent to Church Street Park, where if you go there, you'll still find that at times of day when the park is open, there are all kinds of people there. There are people getting lunch downtown. There are frequently people that are experiencing homelessness there too, and the park space just feels safer, more inviting, better programmed, is staffed appropriately, and hasn't, I think, sacrificed a mission of public service and social service.
When the soccer stadium was being discussed, you said, or you supported the idea of a CBA, a community benefits agreement, being struck between a community group and the stadium group to enshrine on paper some of these promises about pay and about various different benefits the community would get. Do you see that as the future for major city projects? Do you think effectively requiring something like that could risk adverse response from the state?
I think it already has, and I think there are some parts of the model that I would uphold. There are other parts that I think have put pressure on other conversations, right? It was interesting to see that while we had this discussion about the Nashville Needs Impact Fund associated with the stadium deal conversation, and you saw a very late-breaking form of CBA emerge for proposal for the Speedway at the fairgrounds. There's a little bit of too soon to say. I want to make sure we see what eventually shakes out of the current soccer stadium piece. They seem to, like, we know housing is under construction right now. It seems like from the outside looking in that they're planning to hit their affordable housing targets. I know we had on-site childcare and some wage scenarios that were a part of that. But we also knew in that moment, even in being supportive of that concept, Metro can't be a party to that. And so there's a little bit of, all right, we've got some organizations that have expressed interest in facilitating these in the city. Stand Up Nashville was involved in the CBA for the soccer stadium. Urban League of Middle Tennessee was involved in a conversation about River Chase, which was just prior to the discussion about the stadium. Was somewhat involved in the Impact Fund and the adjacency to a CBA concept with the stadium. They were the ones involved in the racetrack. I think at the end of the day, the community part of a community benefits agreement is the most important thing. And so who is trusted in the community to do this? Who has the capacity? I've talked to some of the people on the stakeholder group for the CBA for the soccer stadium, and so far what I'm hearing is encouraging. But we also do know that the state has taken an interest in this and may make future CBAs harder to accomplish, period.
In 2020, when the mayor and the council were considering that property tax increase, really right in the wake of COVID's onset, you proposed an alternative that would have relied on some federal funds that I guess, and help explain to me, the city's finance officials said this is not tenable. So what was the thinking there? Why did you think that would work?
Because of conversations that I had with people at the federal level. The federal government had created facilities specifically for cities to take advantage of. And I can understand, right? There's a priority that an administration has. I knew we had heard from the comptroller as well, but my feeling was that if we had, instead of creating the space for the comptroller's office to come in and wag a finger and say, you ought to do this, that if we said, look, we know on a year-by-year basis, we've got one or more credit facilities available federally, we will work with you, monthly, quarterly, whatever approach to manage across this. The thing I was hearing from property owners, both residentially and commercially, was this is simply too much. And I still believe the approach we were pursuing had enough merit that we should have seriously considered how to build a bridge that was less striking. And it's one of the reasons too why when the budget came out and we had the council substitute, I had an amendment, and I wasn't the only one, that tried to make sure that council's property tax rate increase didn't go above what the mayor's was, and unfortunately I was unsuccessful in both of those efforts.
If elected, you'll inherit a few different fights with the state and the courts related to the airport, related to the racetrack, the size of the Metro Council. Are these things that you would seek to further as mayor? Would you want a legal department that continued those fights, or?
I mean, I'll say it this way. If there is legal merit to cases that defend Nashville's interest from aggressive preemption, we should continue those cases. I'm not going to get elected and say we should withdraw from legal processes already underway. I, as mayor, would not intend to be unnecessarily provocative with the state, but we hope that we find through this fall and winter and coming into spring that the state feels the same way, that this is an opportunity to recalibrate relationships. But we know that the FAA, for instance, has taken an interest in the airport authority process. I think it is appropriate to look at, when Metro is the entity issuing bonds, are we protecting those sufficiently in makeup of various authorities that are putting those bonds forward. I am interested in understanding from the governor's office, both chambers of the General Assembly, what their priorities are. I certainly want to make sure Nashville remains an economically vibrant city, but I also want to make sure that the Metro Charter is recognized as giving us all the tools we need and want for determining the size of things like the Metro Council, but also that the relationship we're having doesn't cause culture war and other kind of partisan political battles to then interfere with the process of actually governing and the mechanics and machinery of government. I think we want to preserve as much local authority there as we can because, again, coming back to the model of District 19 and the idea of the city as a whole, we have provided the state of Tennessee with an incredible amount of revenue for them to use to pursue projects on a statewide basis. I think it's important for both parties to recognize the importance of that and the overall success that when we are allowed to chart our own future, that we offer to Nashvillians, but also to Tennesseans across the state.
After the first round of voting, you saw the maps of the precincts and who was winning in which parts of the city. And it's pretty jarring distinction, and I think it's one we've seen in other elections. You did the best in kind of the center, and towards the southeast, and your opponent, Alice Rowley, did better and sort of a donut around the outer edges of the county. So both politically for the next few weeks, and then if you were to win as an executive and as mayor, how do you plan to reach those people who wouldn't support you?
Yeah, I mean, there is a reality that while we have nonpartisan elections in Nashville, there are different ideologies in the city, and it has historically been the case that the closer you get to the county line in any given direction, you find more conservative Nashvillians. But I think at the end of the day, we won boxes in Bellevue, Old Hickory. We won or came very close to winning in outer line districts like around Cane Ridge. And if you look at the total number of candidates, even in the boxes we didn't win, we already have received public support from Senators Campbell and Yarborough, whose districts encompass most of the geography of the city. I expect we will pick up other endorsements from other candidates very soon. And if you take all of the competing candidate support and where we've already performed with strength, and you kind of look at that as consolidated, and we don't assume we'll get every voter there, but we assume that there is overlap in the interests and beliefs and values of the people who are going to publicly support us, so that if you take all of that and build a map around that, we're going to be in a very good position come Election Day. As we go forward, though, I mean, this is why we did a week-long petition signing event all over the county, from Goodlettsville to Madison to, again, I've been out to the Cane Ridge Community Supper quite a bit. I've knocked doors in just about every part of the county to visit with voters directly on their doorsteps. That process is going to continue as much as we can possibly fit, but also the reality is we spent a year working on those conversations up to Whites Creek and again down to Cane Ridge, Joelton. The election is 1 month from today. And so we have a lot of ground to cover, but we also think that a lot of our message has been effective even into those areas, and that's why we saw some strong performance in places that I think people weren't expecting.
Thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.